All right. So, hi, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for your interest in Family Data Jam and for signing up for our webinar. My name is India Futterman, and I pretty recently joined the Cary Institute education staff back in January, and I am the education program specialist at Cary. So I am coordinating Data Jam this year, both the original Data Jam, which I'll talk about a little bit more, and our new Family Data Jam, which is the subject of this webinar. And Bess Kaplan is also here.
Hi, my name is Bess Kaplan. I work for the Baltimore Ecosystem Study, which is a project by the Cary Institute. So our research is focused here in the Baltimore region, and we also have a data jam competition very similar to the one that's run in the Hudson Valley. So welcome.
All right, so let's get started talking about Data Jam and Family Data Jam. So in its original form, which still very much exists, the Hudson and Baltimore Data Jams are data visualization and interpretation competitions for middle and high school students in the mid-Hudson, Hudson Valley, and Baltimore area generally. So both Cary Institute and Baltimore Ecosystem Study have readily available ecological data sets, often long-term, recording different phenomena, local phenomena been collected by scientists. And so these data sets are available on our websites for students to look at and sort of parse out the ecological relationships and environmental trends that are happening over time in their local environments. And so the Data Jam competition challenges these students to identify those trends, try to provide some reasonable explanation for why they might be occurring, and also communicate those trends and relationships through a creative medium. And that could be either video and animation, visual art, a physical model. We have podcasts, song parodies, really the list is endless. And the point of the competition is really to increase data literacy and to foster a effective data communication, which is really important, not only in STEM careers, but basically in any aspect of life. And so the Family Data Jam is a brand new subcategory of the Hudson and Baltimore Data Jams. We introduced it this year, primarily in response to COVID-related school closures as an activity that all students and learners of all ages can participate in, not just middle and high school students, but students of all ages with their families can collaborate to look at these data sets and interpret them and then produce a creative piece out of it. So rather than doing a full-length report with without necessarily doing any statistical analyses, families can produce sort of a condensed version of our regular traditional Data Jam project for the chance to win a special prize, a special cash prize. And Bess, was there anything that you wanted to add about Family Data Jam?
No, you're doing great.
Perfect, awesome. So this is the first year we've done Family Data Jam, but I did want to show some great projects that we've had from the past from our Hudson Data Jam. So we've had, as I mentioned before, we have a whole variety of creative projects that have been so fun to look at over the past years. And I'll just go clockwise from the left side, this illustration of some fish. So we've had a lot of children's books and illustrated storybooks communicating data trends. And so this on the left is an illustrated storybook about PCB contamination of the Hudson River ecosystem. So just a little background information. PCB stands for polychlorinated biphenyls, and it is this industrial chemical that was discharged into the Hudson until the late 70s, I believe, by the General Electric plant and a couple other industrial plants along the Hudson. And it was this hugely destructive contaminant because the chemical gets bioaccumulated in fish, which means that fish will store and sort of build up concentrations of this chemical in their fatty tissues over time. And that makes them, renders them toxic for human consumption and also obviously harms the fish itself. So we have a storybook sort of illustrating that whole timeline of river contamination and then bioaccumulation within the fish. Another interpretation of that data set was through this interpretive dance, which I personally don't think we see enough dances in Data Jam. I really love this project. The dance was accompanied by captions, sort of explaining what different movements were supposed to represent. Overall, it was a really engaging project. There was music in the background, and each dancer is supposed to represent a fish succumbing to the ill effects of PCBs. Moving on to the right side, we have had a lot of just sort of straightforward visual art representations, often in the form of comics. So I would say that this is not quite like a comic book structure, but this is a diptych, two illustrations side by side representing the impact of zebra mussel populations on the Hudson River ecosystem. So zebra mussels, as I'll talk about a little bit more later in the presentation, are this invasive species of mussel that was introduced in the late 80s and early 90s to the Hudson River. And so these two illustrations very clearly show that within this very short 5-year time period, 1990 to 1994, the Hudson River was completely disrupted ecologically by the presence and the arrival of zebra mussels. I really like the use of color. I like the use of text along with imagery. This was a middle school project that I thought was great. And then we've also had, as I mentioned before, song parodies have been very popular in past years. And one of my favorites is this parody of Bohemian Rhapsody called Glass Eelian Rhapsody. And it is a communication of glass eel migration trends in the Hudson River through song. So glass eels are the juvenile stage of the American eel, and they're really interesting because the glass eels will migrate through tributaries to the Hudson to spawn in, the eels themselves spawn in the Sargasso Sea and then migrate in their juvenile state to the Hudson. And so we've collected data on those migration rates because they're an endangered species. And so this was a song parody sort of interpreting those data trends, which I thought was great. Ooh, I'm sorry, I skipped one. And here's some past projects from Baltimore Data Jam that Beth can speak about a little bit.
Yeah, so just quickly, these were a couple that I really liked over the years. So the one on the left, this was a student team. This was a high school team that looked at vacant houses in Baltimore City. And at the time that they were doing their project, there were about 17,000 vacant houses, vacant row houses in Baltimore City. And so they decided to communicate that data that they would build a row house, which is what you see there, and they attached 17,000 Cheerios to it to illustrate just how big of a number 17,000 is. And they actually counted them out by weight. They didn't actually sit and count out 70,000 Cheerios, but it was very creative. The one in the middle, it's a little hard to tell what's going on, but this was a middle school team that used Minecraft, and they had a data set looking at land cover at various schools in the region. And they used Minecraft to, for each school to kind of build a layout that showed proportionally how much was grass, how much of the land cover was building, and how much was cement or asphalt. And then here on the right is a poem that one of our student teams submitted. So, just like in the Hudson Data Jam, we've had all different kinds of projects, creative projects submitted, and it's kind of the sky's the limit, whatever you guys are excited about doing.
Cool, thank you. So the Data Jam creative project, but the Data Jam in general actually really hinges on this idea of a data story. So what do I mean by a data story? So ecology is really the study of interactions between organisms and among organisms and their environment. And so within those relationships and interactions are feedback loops and adjustments and basically a constant flux in our environment at multiple scales. And so understanding the different drivers of those interactions and the responses of ecosystems to different disturbances can be thought of almost as a story. And so I like to use the zebra mussel example that I mentioned before as sort of it's a nice encapsulation of an ecological story that occurred in the Hudson. It's fairly clear what happened, but it's also complex. There are many different factors involved, and there's lots of different ways to tell this story based on your graph, based on the background information that you can bring in about this phenomena. So as I mentioned before, in the early 90s, late 80s, zebra mussel populations were introduced to the Hudson River in the ballast waters of ships. And you can see on this graph that there were the number of zebra mussels per square meter was 0 up until the early 90s. And then we experienced this huge spike. And rather than zebra mussels continuously going up and increasing in density over time, we see this sort of odd cyclical pattern where populations go up and down and up and down at fairly regular intervals. And so we ask ourselves when looking at this graph of the data, why this occurred, what is driving these changes and these different readjustments to this zebra mussel dynamic ecosystem. And so when we bring in background information such as, okay, well, how are we going to contextualize zebra mussels within their ecological niche? So what are they eating? What temperatures do they survive best at? How many zebra mussels can the Hudson River support at one time? We start to realize that, and we can sort of piece out from this data set that as zebra mussels increase in population density, they will actually deplete the ecosystem of the Hudson River of plankton, which is what they eat primarily. And so at a certain density, there's just no food left for the zebra mussels to consume, and so their populations drop again. And then once the plankton have a chance to recuperate and sort of repopulate the ecosystem, we see an increase in zebra mussels, and then the cycle continues. And so you can think of this as a story where it begins with this introduction of zebra mussels to the Hudson River. We bring in all these different factors involving the ecological niche, and then we can sort of present the phenomena as sort of a holistic event that occurred with many different factors. And this is just one example. The zebra mussel populations are a really popular data set to work with because they're so interesting. Invasive species dynamics are very relevant in the Hudson River, and zebra mussels are sort of iconic for that. And so that's just one example of a data set that you can use, but both Cary Institute and Baltimore Ecosystem Study have a whole suite of different ecological phenomena recorded in data sets that you can look at. So we can provide you the links to these websites following this presentation. I'll probably compile an email of various resources, online resources for you to explore, but basically you can access our data sets readily on each of these websites. And the Cary Institute has about 50 to 60 data sets that are sorted into different levels. And so a level 1 data set would be sort of our most straightforward to interpret, mostly like a time series data set, which is just one variable over time, or just one or two variables to look at. Level 2 is slightly more complex. Multiple variables, perhaps the trend is less easy to parse out from the data set. And then a level 3 data set is our most complex. So that's where our water chemistry comes in, or where this really long-term complex climate data often comes in. So it really depends on the level of experience of your student, or the level of comfort that your student has with working with complex data. And I do think that especially our level 1 data sets are accessible to all learners. And so Baltimore Ecosystem Study has a slightly different sorting scheme for their data. If you want to mention that.
Yeah, so we just divide ours out by middle and high school. That's what we've traditionally done. We don't have quite as many data sets compiled as the Cary Institute, but we also provide links to some external sites that and I think we have a slide about that, So if you don't see a data set that we've already parsed out for you, students are welcome to find their own data set as well. If you're in the Baltimore region, we want to see you using a local data set to that region. So if you're in a Maryland school, don't go to the Hudson site to get your data and then submit it to the Baltimore competition. So just make sure you're selecting data from your area.
And so the data come from a whole variety of sources. Some come from directly scientists working at the Cary Institute or Baltimore Ecosystem Study, studies done by those two institutes. So those are great data sets to use because we're very familiar with them. Bess and I can direct you to the scientists who collected that data if you have any questions about it. That data is typically very thorough. Not to say that other data isn't thorough, but it just comes directly from the source. So we also use data from state departments. We have some data sets from the Department of Health, the USGS, DEC, local colleges will give us data, and also local nonprofits like Riverkeeper, which is a watershed advocate, or the Baltimore Neighborhood Indicators Alliance has been used in the past by Baltimore Data Jam.
Yeah, so if you're kind of new to looking at data, one of the most important things with reputable data sets is something called the metadata, which is data about data. So the metadata tells you where, when, how your data was collected, who collected it, some background information about the data, where you can go for more information. It should have the contact information for the scientist or the group that collected the data. So each of our data sets has associated metadata. So you'll want to take a look at that document for whatever data set you select. And if you go outside of our websites to get your data, you're going to want to read into the data that you are selecting and make sure that that it's clear kind of how that data was collected, because you want to make sure that your data set is reputable. So that's what metadata is. And as part of your write-up about your data, you can use the information we provide in our metadata documents to help you write, with the write-up of your project. So definitely take a look at the metadata.
Right.
Yeah.
Metadata is also important if you're working with a data set that has like units of measurement you're not familiar with. Like say you're not used to working in parts per million. If you're looking at a water chemistry data set, often the metadata will define quantities and sort of contextualize your data in that sense, so you have a better idea of what exactly it is you're looking at and why it was collected. And also some of our metadata sheets have these extension ideas, or sort of inquiry idea starters, which push you to look at the data in a different perspective or give suggestions for what kind of graph you can use. And those can be really helpful sort of boosters for data interpretation. So again, the metadata is very important, and almost all of the Cary Institute data sets are associated with metadata, and those are labeled as enhanced data sets on the website. And all of the PES data sets include metadata. And you can always contact me or Bess for more information about your data set or any questions you may have about it. And so accessing the data is very simple. On the Cary Institute website, when you pull up that data sets page, you'll see a bunch of different cards that just have images and titles for the different data sets. And when you select one of them, you'll be led to another page where you'll see a button that just says blank data, depending on whatever data set you're using. And when you click on that, it will directly download a Google Sheet that's view only. But I'll explain in a little bit how you can copy the data from the Google Sheet and manipulate it on your computer to do whatever you want with it. But the actual data that we're linking to, you can't edit because everyone needs to use it. So, and then for the Baltimore ecosystem study data, it's basically the same thing, except this data link that you click on will lead you to an Excel file download. And we'll talk a little bit about the differences between Excel and Google Sheets. Not super different, but you will be using different systems for both BES and Cary. But that being said, the Google Sheet data can always be converted into Excel and vice versa. So for Google Sheets, as I mentioned before, when you are redirected after clicking that data link on the Cary Institute website, you'll be brought to the Google Sheet file for your data. And so this is going to be view only. You can't really select or copy data within the sheet, but you can click File, Make a Copy, and then you can share. You can save that copy to any place in your personal Google Drive, and then you can manipulate that copy in however way you want. You can delete data, you can change data, although I don't recommend changing the data. You can graph, you can select data within it. So that's how you will be able to work with Cary Institute data, is only by making a copy. And then when you graph in Google Sheets, it's fairly simple. You'll select your data and click Insert Chart. And Google Sheets is great because it's smart. It can look at your data and pick the right kind of graph for your data and sort of automatically generate that. And so it can see, for instance, in this data set that we're graphing several variables by year, so a line graph is appropriate. Now, I wish I could spend more time going into the intricacies of graphing in each of these programs, but that would be a whole other webinar. But that being said, I am available for any tech support that I can offer remotely if you're having any trouble with Google Sheets, but it's a pretty intuitive and user-friendly platform for graphing. And you can use all different kinds of charts, not just line charts. And I'll talk a little bit later on in the presentation about graph choice. And how you can go about choosing your graph. And we also have, from the Cary Institute, our Hudson Valley data, we have a really great tool through Tuva, which is a data visualization platform. I'm just going to play this quick video of me going through the website. So almost all of our data sets from Cary Institute are linked to this Tuva portal. And so I'll provide the link in my email, my follow-up email to this webinar. But you can access the data sets on this platform and use the tools to graph your data in a very interactive and user-friendly manner. And so you'll see, let me speed up a little bit. When I select a data set, it brings me to some background information on the data set. And it tells me what the variables are. And then when I X out of that, I am led to this interface where I can drag and drop variables to the different axes, and they'll automatically graph for me. And this is free to use. This is a great option for like our middle level students or learners who maybe are beyond hand graphing but don't have a lot of experience with Excel or Google Sheets and would just like something that very clearly and very interactively shows how data is graphed. And you don't have to just use dot plots or line graphs. There are all different types of charts that you can use, and your data will sort of automatically morph and change to the chart type of chart that you choose. And so it's a great option. There's some limitations, like if you're doing a time series, you can't really graph multiple variables over one period of time, but if you play around with it and refer to this user guide that you can see in the bottom right corner, then that can walk you through it and sort of show you what the capabilities are. So that's a really great tool. And I do want to talk a little bit about graph choice. Again, this is something that we could spend an entire webinar talking about, but there are lots of different types of graphs you can use, but only certain types of graphs are appropriate for the data set that you choose. So for the most part, I would say the most popular graphs to use are line graphs, which is the center middle graph, because a lot of our data is time series, so graphing a variable over a period of time. And so on your x-axis, you would have the year or month or whatever time interval you're graphing. Continuous, it has to be continuous. and then on your y-axis, that would be the quantity of your variable that you're graphing. And so this is a good way to show change over time, but also change over a spatial extent if it's quantified. So say you have southernmost to northernmost reach of the Hudson and how salinity changes along that length. You could also conceivably do a line graph. Bar graphs are a very simple graph that you can use for showing differences between categories. Scatter plots are a great tool to use for comparing or for assessing the relationship between two different variables. So rather than a variable versus time, you could say, how does the population of zebra mussels, for instance, relate to the number of phytoplankton in the water? And so if you fit a trend line to that scatter plot, which I'll talk about in a little bit, you can assess the relative the relationships between the two variables and how strongly they're related, how strongly one affects the other. And then finally, a histogram is a great tool for looking at variability in your data set. I've never really seen a map being used in DataJam, and I understand that maps can be really tricky for a number of reasons, but it would be great to see some of our spatial data represented in a map. So one way that you could do this is to print out a map online that you find on Google Maps or anywhere else, and either add graduated symbols, which are where the area of the symbol corresponds to the value that you're looking at. So if you're looking at, for instance, number of trees per county, you could print out a county map and then come up with a scheme for how much the area of a symbol corresponds to the number of trees in your county, and then apply that on the map. Or a choropleth map, which is what this sort of shaded map is called, is basically a similar concept, but instead of these symbols, you're using like the degree of shading to indicate the quantity of a variable that you're measuring. And then when it comes to interpreting your graph, you can get as simple or as complicated as you like. So in terms of elementary students who maybe don't have experience with graphing at all or have less experience, you can look at the shape of your graph and just do purely a qualitative analysis. So especially if you're doing a line graph over time, this is a graph of zebra mussel populations. As you might remember, we have this cyclical pattern. Is your graph, is the line going in one direction? Is it going up? Is it going down? Is it going up and down? Why might that be? How is it changing over time? You don't have to apply a line of best fit. You don't have to do any sort of statistical analysis. You can simply look at the shape of your line and try to draw a conclusion about change over time from that. Again, looking at differences between groups in these stacked bar graphs or just regular bar graphs. Are there differences between groups? How extreme are those differences? What is the deal with this outlier that's so enormously huge compared to the other ones? And then if you're doing a scatter plot and you fit a trend line to your scatter plot, which basically is a line that is attempting to be drawn closest to all your data points, it gets the trend line math gets complicated very quickly, but in simplest terms, it's a line that is supposed to represent the relationship of one variable to another. You can fit a trend line to your scatter plot and simply say, okay, is it pointing down? Is it pointing up? How closely do all the points cluster around the line? In this case, it's not great. The line is not a great fit because the points are scattered. And you could say, okay, well, maybe the relationship isn't very strong. But since the line is pointing downward, that's a negative correlation. We're implying a negative correlation, which means that an increase in one variable results in a decrease in another variable. Briefly on the written component, you will want to communicate in words the trend that you observe in your graph. This can be a couple sentences, just qualitatively what you notice about your data set, about your graph. So is there an increase? Is there a cyclical pattern? What is the difference between different categories and different groups that you've measured? And then a brief explanation of why you think this trend occurred. So that can be pulling in data from your metadata sheet or other background information that you have acquired. So this is just putting your observed trends into words. And then after that is complete, then you can really start to get to work on your creative project. And so our next webinar is going to focus on creative communication of data trends. And so, but this is really the base of your Data Jam project, is identifying these trends and explaining why they might have occurred.